Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. This is the Graduate School of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. And we're talking about philosophical underpinnings of the theological tradition. We're now to the point of discussing Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm lived from 1033 to 1109, followed in the Platonic Augustinian tradition, and you should know a little bit about what I mean by that by now. He was a realist, and you should know what that means by now. He asserted the ontological existence of universals, right? He claimed that also to know X, one must know why it is that X must be. This is his presupposition to much of his work. He's really a rationalist. To know that a thing is, one must know why that which is must be as it is. You get that? So he's dealing here with some modal claims. I mean, this goes back in the tradition, but he's trying to say that in order to know a thing, we have to know it in its necessity. Now, this is certainly true when it comes to mathematics, right? If I want to know that the square root of 2 is irrational, I can listen to my teacher say, you know, Bielfeldt, the square root of 2 is irrational. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I could say, and Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right? 2 little facts I know. But to really know that the square root of 2 is irrational, I have to be able to prove it. I have to be able to do the proof. It's not that hard a proof. I won't do it right here. But it's something that, generations of students once knew how to do when we studied geometry in high school. But we don't do that anymore, do we? So we don't derive theorems. We don't know how to do that anymore. And our mathematical education oftentimes isn't done in terms of theoretical math, but sort of practical applications. And of course, this is a great pity because, of course, we can have computers that are awfully good at solving calculus problems, the application. What we know, what we should know is the theorems. We should know the proofs, right? Because computers aren't as good as this, as doing that. Well, anyway, Anselm's basic approach was a fides caerens intellectum, which means faith seeking understanding. So he starts with faith, and then he tries to show how the truths of faith are in some sense necessary truths. And once we understand their necessity, then we come to understand them, right? It's a faith which seeks understanding. He's not trying to replace understanding with faith. Faith is the beginning, and then he is trying to understand that which is believed. Now, he believes that faith is volitional. It's an act of the will, not an epistemic state. Okay, this is different than certainly somebody like David Hume, that you cannot will your beliefs. But in this tradition, this rationalist tradition, one could hold that there are a set of beliefs, and one could, through the will, assent to those things, even if they seem not to be true. One's still giving mental assent to these things. Well, in his faith-seeking understanding project, he means something like an active love of God, seeking a deeper knowledge of God. So there's an active loving of God that we have. And of course, assenting is an act of love as well, right? Assenting to the truths. He has arguments to establish the existence of God and God's divine properties that he gives us in his monologium and his proslogium. But he's basically known, of course, for his very, very famous ontological argument, which, if you don't know anything about Anselm, you'll certainly know that he's the author of this so-called ontological argument for the existence of God. And classically, you will learn, if you take philosophy of religion here at the Institute of Lutheran Theology, you will learn what every other student that takes philosophy of religion learns, and that there are three general arguments in the tradition for God, the so-called cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument for the existence of God. And then there are other arguments as well, arguments from experience, but these are the three classic kinds of arguments. And the ontological argument basically can be seen to be of two kinds here with our good friend Anselm. Anselm believes that God just is that which none greater can be thought. Okay? God is that which none greater can be thought. So we have a definition of God. God just is that which none greater can be thought. There you go. God just is that which none greater can be thought. It's a definition of God. A triangle has three angles, right? A triangle is this plane scalar figure having three angles. God is that which none greater can be thought. Okay, now, is God conceivable? He says God is conceivable as that which none greater can be thought. So if God is conceivable as that which none greater can be thought, then we say, can God not exist? Okay, so this is a reductio. So this would be our sort of second assertion. To assume God does not exist. I can put all this in nicely in logical form, but I won't. Assume God does not exist, okay? So if you assume that God does not exist, God would exist in re, or God would exist in mente, in the mind, but not exist in re. So if assuming that God does not exist, God does not exist in re. Okay? But God is that which none greater can be thought. So if God which is that which none greater can be thought, then God would not be, is not that which none greater can be thought if he exists in re. Every time I do this, I do it in a different way. You know, I just put it. This is the way I feel like doing it today, so that's how I'm doing it. So God is not that which none greater can be thought, but we now have a contradiction because God is that which none greater can be thought by one, and is not that which none greater can be thought by four. So you've derived a contradiction, so God must exist. I don't even know if you can see that anymore on the blackboard. If you can't, trust me, you probably can't, so I apologize for that. But anyway, if we assume that God does not exist, we derive a contradiction because now we have a God that is not that which none greater can be thought, because of course it's greater to exist in reality and in thought rather than merely in thought, right, in mente. So if God is that which none greater can be thought, God cannot not exist. God cannot not exist, because then he wouldn't be that which none greater can be thought. Now, of course, Kant and others have criticized this argument basically by saying that Anselm here has confused the concept of a thing from its instantiation. Of course, God, it is true that maybe God cannot be that which none greater can be thought if God does not exist. So maybe it is the case that the concept of existence is part of the concept of God, but that does not mean that God exists. Right? Well, I won't go down the obvious way to go here. I can spend the entire time here, the next hour, just on this point. But what Anselm has tried to do is to try to show that divine existence is part of divine properties. And, certainly in a tradition, the essence of God is his existence. That's certainly what Aquinas will hold as well. And so this is not a dumb thing to do at all, but the question remains, even if at the level of the concept a non-existent God wouldn't be God, that still doesn't mean at the level of actuality that God exists. Because you could have the concept of God existing without the instantiation of the God existing within which concept existence is held. Makes sense? He also has another argument, which I won't sketch out, but it's more interesting, actually. This is the argument from this necessity that basically is God is that which none greater can be thought. Is it greater for God to exist necessarily or contingently? Contingently means that God exists, but he could not exist. Necessity means that God cannot not exist. Well, it seems to be greater to exist necessarily than merely contingently. Therefore, God, as that which none greater can be thought, does not merely happen to exist, he exists necessarily. Right? Now, basically, this is a move from what we might call the possibility of God. This is a possibility operator. To the necessity of God. Basically, the move, and then Leibniz exploited this, is from the possibility of a thing entailing its necessity. All you have to do then is show the possibility of God in order to show the necessity of God. Okay. Well, if you think about this, I'll just do a little manipulation here. This is logically equivalent to it's not possible God or necessarily God, which is now this gets us the necessarily not God, or because you got to bring that necessity operator over, not possible, which means necessity not. So you either have the necessity of not God or the necessity of God. That's saying this. And so if you set it up this way, that it's either necessarily the case that not God or necessarily the case that God, then it comes out that probably God, it's more reasonable to say that God necessarily exists than God necessarily does not exist. Now, if this seems very odd to you, think about mathematics, right? In mathematics, we use the principle of contradiction all of the time to show that something is. If something cannot not obtain, it is. So in mathematics, we will do a proof, and we will do exactly what I did here. We will do an indirect proof or a reductio. We'll assume the negation of something. We'll show that that leads to contradiction. If that leads to contradiction, then the thing necessarily is, right? And in mathematics, all truths are either necessary or impossible. That is to say, they're either so in every possible world or they're not in any possible world. So when we get to the level of the divine, if it's like mathematics that way, then there's all kinds of reasons to opt here for the necessary existence of God. Now, I should tell you that not dumb people have thought this. A lot of very smart people, including the great mathematician Gödel, whose incompleteness proof revolutionized mathematical thinking in the 20th century. It's probably one of the crowning intellectual achievements of the 20th century. I don't know who will finally prevail, Einstein or Gödel, but they were both very bright, and they ended up in Princeton together. Gödel was a melancholy kind of guy, but he liked to hang out with Einstein. At any rate, Gödel spent the last part of his life working on the ontological argument for the existence of God. So, there you go. So if God is possible, then God is necessary, thus God is. I won't go any further down here, but to tell you that with Anselm we get a lot of fodder for philosophical thinking, and we find it in the subsequent tradition. Now he also has a book called Cur Deus Homo, which why be God man? Why does God be Cur Deus sit homo? Why does God become man, or why would God be man, right? And he said that God had to become man because God had to find a way to deal with human sin. And he claims here that God must always do what is reasonable to bring about the best state. Okay, so now, human beings sin, okay? So if human beings sin, they have dishonored God. Now in a feudal society, your punishment increases to the degree of the place in society the one you've offended occupies. So he claims that God is an infinite monarch, and he's dishonored then by any act against him. He presupposes this notion of justice, the returning of likes for likes. And with an infinite being, even if we only offend him in what we might consider a very mild way, because he's infinite, we've offended him infinitely. And we owe an infinite debt to him because we've offended an infinite being. Now, if you've read the Confessions of Augustine, I remember reading them in college, sitting there thinking, boy, this guy he's really into this apple thing. Remember, he takes the apple from the tree, and now it's just a horrible thing. He's taking this apple from the tree. But if you really believe that God is an infinite being with intentionality and that exists and holds your life in the palm of his hands, if you offend an infinite being by doing something wrong, you have created an infinite distance between yourself and that being, an infinite debt that must be paid. And of course, a human being can never repay an infinite debt, right? We can't do it because we're only finite beings. The currency of infinity is not us. So only God himself could repay an infinite debt. But if God repaid the debt, it wouldn't be returning likes from likes. It would just be letting us off the hook. Man has to return the debt to God, but it can't just be man because man doesn't have the value to return the debt. So it has to be God become man, right? In order to repay the debt owed to God. Thus, a human being who is in some sense God, but still is a human being, is needed to repay the infinite debt, and this human being can only be the God-man, Jesus the Christ. It's an interesting argument. It became a very important argument in the tradition. It's called the satisfaction theory of atonement. He also claims, Anselm, that freedom is the power to preserve the rectitude of the will for its own sake. Okay? So a true freedom of choice does not entail the power to sin, because God and the angels have such freedom, but do not sin. Right? Human beings' freedom is the power to be in consonance with God. Freedom is to be and to do what we ought to be and to do. Right? That's true freedom. Sin is addiction, and it takes away all freedom. Humans have the power for self-initiated action, and such a power eventuated in sin, but it does not presuppose it. Fallen angels sin because their desire for happiness outpaces their desire for justice. Humans fell for similar reasons and now need divine grace to desire justice again. Now this gets us into theology a little bit more than philosophy, so I'll just hold that at this point. And I'm going to say just a couple words about Abelard and Lombard, and then we'll go on to the next lecture. Peter Abelard I will talk about more next time. Here I just want to point out that he was born in 1079, died in 1142, known for his love of Eloise. The letters are very famous of this. He's said to have founded the University of Paris in 1136, claimed that universals were mental concepts. Argued that sin is not defined in terms of action, but in terms of intent. And he is called the author of the scholastic method, the skenon, that is the yes and no. And I will come back to Abelard in a later lecture. I just want to lay him out on the table as someone where we will talk about his philosophy. Peter Lombard, known as the great author of the Sentences, he read the Damascene, John of Damascus, and quoted him extensively in his Sentences, and this textbook became the standard theology textbook for the next 400 years. And if you just read these things, I mean, it's hard to read any of this stuff without getting deeply into philosophy, right? The first deals with God, the second with creatures, the third incarnation, redemption and virtues, sacraments, eschatology. He developed the scholastic method, again, of Abelard. Not known as an original thinker, but someone who compiled the positions from extant materials. I'm going to come back next time. We'll come back, talk a little bit about the 12th century, and we'll be right back. Thank you.